What up, guys? It is Alex West, host of the And1 podcast, reminding you that you can subscribe on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on YouTube, wherever it is you listen to your podcast, so you're always up to date on what we are doing. Today, I'm joined by Josh Cornelissen, writer for HoopsHabit, for Lottery Mafia, and for the 94 Feet Report, and we're talking about the Eastern Conference. A couple of weeks ago, Josh was on and we talked about the Western Conference and the teams that are going to make the playoffs. Today, we talk about the 8 teams that will make the playoffs for the Eastern Conference and the things that might stand in their way between them and a trip to the NBA Finals. It's a pretty good show. Give it a listen and let me know what you think. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA. Follow the show at And1 Analytics. And as always, Brent, take us away. I'd like to welcome my guest to the podcast today, Josh Cornelissen. Josh, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Alex, and ready for the playoffs to start.
I am too, man. I've watched a lot of college basketball, doing draft prep and stuff over the past couple of months, and I've kind of been a little bit lackadaisical when it comes to my NBA watching, but I can't quite get back into the grind when the games don't particularly matter. I can find myself watching a lot of Western Conference games, but the East is a little bit harder to watch right now.
No, I understand that, especially since the West has so much more drama because there's still technically 10 teams in play for 8 spots. In the East, Detroit technically has like a 0.005%, but we've had the playoff field set for what feels like a couple months now. So the drama is kind of at a lower level.
Yeah, we're here on Monday. We're talking right now on Monday, April 2nd. There's no NBA games tonight, which is a little bit sad because the NCAA championship game doesn't start till 9:20. But I felt like it gave us a good opportunity to sort of take the scope of the Eastern Conference, which is exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about those 8 playoff teams and sort of the storylines that are running with it, and then maybe address some of the concerns that will come up for these teams as we go into the playoffs. So, Josh, you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, so let's start with your Milwaukee Bucks. You cover the Bucks for HoopsHabit. This is a team that has not played well. They're 5-5. They seem to be less than the sum of their parts. They're Giannis and friends. I mean, what's going on with this team, and what's the outlook for the final 5 games and then going into the playoffs?
Yeah, I think Milwaukee's been somewhat of an enigma all year, which is strange because they've pretty much been the same team all year. You had that little dip when Kidd was first fired and Joe Prunty came in with this idea that they were going to change their defensive scheme to something that actually worked. And they've kind of made token changes, but at the core, this team is still playing the same way. It's still making the same mistakes. They're overhelping. They just don't have great defensive instincts right now as far as their scheme. And so I think that that's going to continue to hurt them all the way through the rest of the season into the playoffs. But it should be pointed out, the Bucks just had a 4-game road trip. They were in a tight game late against the Clippers before losing in LA. Then they beat the Warriors, where Kevin Durant got ejected. They beat the Lakers, and then they were in hand to beat the Nuggets on Sunday night before it kind of all fell apart. Giannis got his 6th foul. He fouled out with just a couple of minutes to play with the Bucks up by I think 11, and the Nuggets just came storming back without him on the court with Jabari in his place, and they sent it to overtime and ultimately won. So the Bucks have been frisky of late and are really pushing as if they want to get up from the 8th seed into that 7th spot, which probably looks a little bit more lucrative. But ultimately, this team has continued to be the same thing all year, which is it should be better, and it's not.
Yeah, there are losses when you look at the schedule. Even over the past couple of months, there are losses that you look at and you just wonder what was going on, including a loss to – I was just looking at it. Where was it? Well, no, none of their recent losses, but I had one. This is what happens when you go live on the show. You start talking about things and then you realize you don't know what it is you're talking about. But, you look across the spectrum of the entire season and you see a team that, like you said, is very hard to define. And I feel like a lot of that comes to rest at the feet of Joe Prunty, at Jason Kidd, and we saw what happened to him. But the inconsistent coaching is probably going to keep Joe Prunty from taking the interim tag off of beside his name. Does that sound reasonable to you?
I think Joe Prunty absolutely had a chance at proving something different, and he absolutely has not taken hold of that chance. So I'd say less than 5% chance he's retained. I think they're going to do a wide net for the coaching search, definitely look at all the candidates. And this is going to be a well sought after job because you do see the talent there. It's not just Giannis, which he's a top 5 player. He plays the position you want as a forward. He's exactly what you would want as a coach to have as your star player. But the talent around him is actually really good. I mean, Chris Middleton, Eric Bledsoe, these guys are both fringe all-stars. Malcolm Brogdon has outperformed his draft slot. There are pieces here that look solid. Even Sterling Brown, I think, was a great find in the second round yet again. So there's talent here, and there's a lot of potential. And I think the right kind of coach could absolutely look at this situation and go, man, if I stepped in here, I could make this team great. So I think it's going to be a hot coaching job this summer.
I think it's probably the hottest job in the league at this point. And I have heard a name sort of kicked around, not with any veracity behind it, not sourced or anything, but the name I've heard kicked around is Villanova's Jay Wright. And Jay Wright has installed a system at Villanova that has just looked very NBA ready. I mean, he's shooting a lot of three-pointers. He's spacing the floor very well. This is a coach who's still young in his 50s and sort of understands the flow of the game. I think he could be an interesting name, but there are a number of interesting names out there, and not the least of which, you have a superstar in Giannis Antetokounmpo, so the job is appealing, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's definitely going to be time to go over coaching candidates. We definitely should, because I think you're right about this being the hottest job that's likely to be open. But I think one other thing to point out about this team, sorry, I'm lost my train of thought completely, Alex.
That's all right. Happens to me all the time.
It was really good. It was really good, whatever it was. If you got any other thoughts,
okay,
I know there's one other thing I wanted to point out. Go ahead.
You're going to find it. I'm sure you are. Listen, this is just what happens. Like, you push that button, you see that you're recording, and all of a sudden your mind just goes everywhere. My last thing on Milwaukee was, I think one of the looming questions is with Jabari Parker's contract. He is set to become a restricted free agent. There's obviously going to be a lot of money available for him to seek. However, I'm not sure how many teams are going to offer him. And to me, I feel like Milwaukee is sort of at a disadvantage in that they have to match these offers because they're not going to be able to be flexible and add another piece. And so they just sort of have to keep Jabari in house. Jabari has been about what we expected him to be when he came back, is a pretty decent offensive player and an absolute turnstile on defense. Do you think he's $100 million man? I mean, what does Milwaukee have to do in this tough situation?
So Milwaukee probably has to keep him, or they have to trade him, which will be difficult to do, him being a restricted free agent. They can't let him walk away for no value, because you're right, they're hampered in their ability to do much else. They are, right up against the cap. They will be well over the cap if they re-sign him for anything. And they're probably going to have to end up stretching someone, especially if they can't get off the contract of Mirza Teletovic, who may never play another basketball game. So they have a lot of money tied up. And so they've got to figure out, okay, how do we improve this team? And maybe that's Jabari getting healthy and getting better. But they've got to figure that out. The thing that's going to work out for the Bucks is that not a lot of teams have money, especially the ones that do. They're going to use their money on guys like, Paul George or Danny Green or Avery Bradley, these guys that are going to be, moving around in free agency without the restricted label. Because with Jabari as a restricted free agent, they're going to have to tie up their cap space all the way through July 9th. I don't think anyone's going to want to do that. So I think that helps Milwaukee. It's going to give them leverage to maybe re-sign him for a contract more in the 12 to 16 million a year range rather than the low 20s. And so to circle back around to the point I was going to say, Milwaukee, when they traded for Eric Bledsoe, traded a conditional first-round pick. It's actually weird in that there's like a little pocket where it goes to Phoenix, and otherwise the Bucks get to keep it. Well, unfortunately for Milwaukee, they're in that pocket right now. And so if they don't finish probably sixth in the East, they're going to lose the pick to the Suns. If they can get up to sixth, or if the bottom of the West slides down a little bit, then maybe they'll get to add the pick. And I think that's really important, because this draft looks to have a lot of interesting options in it, and it's really deep at center, which strangely is where Milwaukee really needs to upgrade, with Thon Maker having a regression this year. So I think that that's going to be something to watch just over the last week of the season. Is Milwaukee going to win a couple games and climb up the standings just a hair, or are they going to have to trade that pick over to Phoenix?
Interesting that you say that Milwaukee needs a center. I mean, a lot has been made of their length and the way they have built a team around apparently just Jay Billis's favorite word, wingspan. But as you go forward, looking to add another piece, these middle draft picks have become far more important. I mean, Giannis himself was the 15th pick in the draft. It's entirely possible to add an impact player. And to lose that pick is going to be a little bit devastating for a team that looks to be budding into a pretty good team if they can sort of iron out all the pieces. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more, in a couple of weeks about these playoff matchups, and we're going to break them down. But the last thing I want to say on Milwaukee is that when you have a player like Giannis Antetokounmpo, what you do is put yourself in a position to win games, no matter who they play, unless it's the Cavaliers. If they play the Raptors, if they play the Sixers, if they play the Celtics, Giannis is probably the best player on the floor. And when you have the best player on the floor, you put yourself in a position to win a playoff series. And, I think that might be on the table. Obviously, it'll take a lot of things going right for Milwaukee, but, am I off base there?
No, not at all. I think no team looks at Giannis and goes, oh, we want to play him. We want to match up with him. And if you look, I mean, there's obviously Milwaukee has struggled and they're down at the bottom of the playoff standings, but they beat every one of the teams they could potentially match up with. They've beaten Toronto this year. They beat Boston way back at the beginning of the year. They've beat Cleveland in late December, and they beat Philly just last month. So they definitely have the ability to knock off a better team. Now, can they do it over 7 games? That's going to take Giannis really putting everything on his back. And I think he's capable of doing that. It's just whether or not he will, and whether there's someone on the other side of the ball, i.e. like LeBron, who can take over himself in a stronger way.
So let's move on to the 7th seed. Right now, obviously Milwaukee is tied for the 7th seed. The tiebreaker situation is always a conundrum, but according to the list I'm looking at, the Bucks are 8th, and the 7th seed is the Miami Heat. So that's just what we're going to go with for the sake of discussion. The Heat have been in a little bit of turmoil. They have not been stellar, sort of backsliding into the playoffs. Also, they're 5-5 over their last 10. But the big story for Miami is this Hassan Whiteside story. And let me just read the quote. Let's just put it out there. This was after a loss to the Brooklyn Nets. I about said the New Jersey Nets like an old man. He said, "It's annoying. We shouldn't. Why are we matching up? We've got one of the best centers in the league," referring to himself. "Why are we matching up? A lot of teams don't have a good center, and they're going to use their strengths. It's bullshit. It's really bullshit, man. There's a lot of teams that could use a center. That's one of them. That's bullshit." And that's what he said after the loss, which is just a whole suitcase of interesting things going on there.
Yeah, I think Whiteside has this chip on his shoulder that he's better than everybody else says he is. And so, he's gotten in squabbles on Twitter. He was kind of baited into this by beat reporters who knew he was upset and what he was upset about. Whiteside is thinks he's this, 90s behemoth in the center, like Olajuwon or Ewing or Robinson, and just feed it to him. He's going to score. He's going to defend the rim. And he kind of has that outline if you squint at him. But in reality, the Heat's defense is equally as good with him off the court as it is with him on. And their offense is better when they can get a floor spacer such as Kelly Olynyk. And I think when you look at Bam Adebayo on the bench, Whiteside probably sees a better version of what he's able to provide with more energy, younger, and cheaper. So he's probably getting scared a little bit. They may try to move him, that they may continue to marginalize him. And with his inflated view of himself, he doesn't see himself as a 25-minute-a-game player. He thinks he should be playing in the upper 30s like these other star players. And obviously Miami's right to limit his minutes, but that's going to cause friction that could continue to hurt them because, they do need Whiteside to be able to compete in the playoffs. They do need his minutes, just not as many of them as Whiteside probably wants.
Yeah, the interesting thing is the way they've constructed this roster in Miami. They have done a lot of little spending things that have amounted to a pretty tight salary situation. Obviously, with the contract to Kelly Olynyk, the Tyler Johnson deal, Dion Waiters' money. There are a lot of players on this team who are getting pretty reasonable salaries. But when you look at it, what they don't have is that superstar player, and Whitesides believes he is that player. And maybe you can have arguments. He's a 14 point a game, 11 rebound a game player, but he doesn't have a ton of range. He doesn't space the floor very well. And then, when you look at the pairing of Olynyk and Adebayo, or particularly when they play James Johnson at the power forward, this is a team that can do a lot of things and maintain a lot of flexibility. So it's an interesting question because their best player might also be expendable when you come right down to it. But I'm not sure who wants to take on this Whiteside money, if anyone. So he's in a bit of a log jam when it comes to his future. And it will be interesting to see what he wants to do. If he forces his way out, it's very hard to see a path where he's still in Miami next season without significant reparations between he and the organization.
And let's be honest, Pat Riley is not interested in reparations. He doesn't care if his players like him. So I think it's going to be a sticky situation because you're right, there's not a lot of teams out there that want a center and want to pay this much for a center. But one team I would keep an eye on would be the Dallas Mavericks. They're going to have cap space to be able to absorb a contract like that. And he's the kind of player that they seem to like, a bigger center down low. You remember they went after DeAndre Jordan. They traded for Nerlens Noel. So that's possibly a fit for him. But I think that the market's going to be limited. So I don't think Miami will have a lot of options. I don't think they're likely to get much in return for him. But honestly, they may not need it because I really like what they've done with all these different pieces they put together. Josh Richardson might actually be the best player on this team.
Yes.
And just the way that every single player gets after it defensively. I mean, when you're looking, let's say they go small, James Johnson, Justice Winslow, Josh Richardson, just that lineup is going to be incredible defensively, and nobody wants to try to score against that. So I think you have to have a smart coach when you've got a bunch of nickels that you're trying to put together into a quarter. But I think that they can succeed in that with Eric Spoelstra. And I think Miami has kind of the legs to be a little bit frisky in the playoffs. I don't think any team's going to be necessarily excited to see them.
No, definitely not. And what's really interesting is they've sort of done this despite Justice Winslow not developing along the trajectory that they thought he would. He was a player, young kid that came out of Duke, and he's only 21 now. He's had a couple of seasons, but he has never really blossomed into the player that they thought he was. And despite that, they have found these diamonds in the rough in Tyler Johnson and Josh Richardson and James Johnson. They have found these lineups that tend to work. And so I guess it's just a tribute to Spoelstra and what a great coach he is. They say that 5 coaches in the league matter for wins, 5 coaches matter for losses, and the other 20 don't really matter. And if I was making that list, I would probably put Eric Spoelstra in that top 5. He is a coach who has significantly made a difference in this roster. The more you watch them through the season, there are a lot of wins that the best player the Miami Heat suited up was Eric Spoelstra.
I think it's absolutely right. I think I'd probably say there's like 8 in the league that make a difference, but okay. I understand the point, and I think Spoelstra definitely has proven he should be up there just from how he reinvented a whole system with the big 3 during that era to how he's continually had different pieces and kept the Miami Heat productive. So, and the other thing is you kind of watch in the race towards the end, if Miami wants to be in that 7 seed, I think they've got the inside track over Milwaukee. They get to play Atlanta twice, and they get to play the Knicks. And then Toronto, they play on the last night of the season when the Raptors could have their seed locked up. So it definitely looks like the Heat, who have the tiebreaker over the Bucks, are in line to finish above Milwaukee in 7 or possibly even higher.
Interesting thing about that is the Heat have given the Celtics problems all year long, and Hassan Whiteside is not the least among that. He's a huge problem for the Celtics, who have a big problem with centers like Drummond, with these big centers that really dominate down low, give the Celtics a lot of trouble, and they have to play Aaron Baines for extended minutes. So it will be interesting to see over the next couple of days how that sort of shapes out, because this Boston roster is hobbled, but even as a healthy roster, the Heat have shown that they can give them problems. So maybe they are gunning for that 7 seed.
Yeah, maybe they are. I think they definitely would rather avoid Toronto, who I think is deep enough to match up with Miami. And I think ultimately nobody wants to play LeBron as much as the Heat may like to get that series, and the Heat fans may like to take on LeBron. I think ultimately Boston's probably the place they want to be.
Yeah, no, they do not want to take on LeBron. You should not ever want that. We'll move on from the Heat. Going to talk about the Wizards for a few minutes. Return of John Wall just a couple of days ago. John Wall made his return. It's his first game back. Now, it started off pretty promising when Wall went out a couple of months ago, and it looked like he was going to not necessarily be missed as much as we thought he would. And then there was a little bit of a regression to the mean. The ball sort of started sticking. Bradley Beal had to take a lot of shots, but now he's returned and working him back into the rotation and his place back into the offense is going to be a pivotal point for the Wizards to nail down before the playoffs start. How is John Wall's return this late in the season going to impact anything that they can possibly do in the postseason, Josh?
I think that the narrative that you lose your best player and suddenly you're better, that's false. And it just looks that way because the team probably really digs in because they're like, man, we got to play hard. Our best guy isn't here. And so I think that helped them win some games. But ultimately, this is a flawed roster. And so John Wall is going to raise the ceiling on the team. And if they have any chance of pulling an upset in the first round, he'll be the key to it. But I just don't see it. The way that Brad Stevens has the Celtics playing recently, and I know we'll get to them later, I don't think Washington really has a chance against anyone in the East. I think that they have been almost falling apart down the stretch here. They just lost a crucial game to the Bulls, who were trotting out, just the dregs of their roster. They've lost to the Pistons, to the Knicks, to the Nuggets, all these teams that are outside the playoffs right now. And they've just been kind of a mediocre team, probably worse than that over the last month. And they're kind of trending the wrong way as the playoffs approach. Now, you might hope John Wall coming back, that'll lift him up, but I just don't think he can. I think his team has too many problems, and ultimately they're not going to be able to make much noise in the playoffs. In fact, out of all the 8 teams, I think I'd have the Wizards, if in a power rankings kind of setup, they'd be the team I'd most be open to playing in the first round.
I agree with you 100%. This is a roster that feels so close to legitimacy, and it's just not quite there. Otto Porter has blossomed into a fantastic player. He still sort of has his flaws. Kelly Oubre has really come along, but it seems like maybe it's that they've stuck with Gortat. Maybe it's that they spent $40 trillion on Jan Mahinmi. I don't know what the situation is, but it just feels like the roster is probably 2 pieces short of what they would want it to be. And I just have to agree with you. I don't see a situation wherein the Wizards take more than a game or 2 off of any of the top seeds in the East right now.
I'm completely with you there. And I think, they haven't had the opportunity to play LeBron in Cleveland. There's always been that talk that if they just got a shot at him.
No.
But I think if LeBron's going to continue his streak of never losing a game in the first round, Washington's the team they're going to want to see. And right now, that's who they're matched up with.
Yeah, that's this whole rivalry that never happened thing. It feels like a 30 for 30 that got made about 12 years from now. But no, LeBron is not afraid of the Wizards or what they bring to the table, despite what they said after the playoffs last year. This is a team that will probably get swept against Cleveland, and they might take a game off the Celtics or the Sixers, just sort of depending on how everything shapes out. But let's move on from them. I mean, I just feel like that's a pretty done discussion right now until we see evidence to the contrary. And let's talk about one of the most surprising teams in the Eastern Conference, and that's the Indiana Pacers. They started out red hot. Victor Oladipo was playing some of the best basketball he's ever played, most definitely, but just some of the best basketball in the league, and sort of was looking like an all-NBA player. Now, he may end up with a second or third team all-NBA nod before it's all said and done, and he's cooled off a little, but the Pacers are 46-31, and they've won 5 games in a row. This is a good-looking young team, and I think a lot of us didn't think that after the trade that sent Paul George to Oklahoma City went down.
Hey, I was one of the group calling for the Pacers to finish at the bottom of the East. So I'm not going to suggest that I saw this coming, but Oladipo has taken a huge step forward. He deserves all NBA mention. I think that he has a real case to be on that third team as a guard. And I think that the team around him has really stepped up their play. I think having consistent play at the point guard position has been helpful with Corey Joseph and Darren Collison. They've got 48 minutes of above average point guard play. I think that Miles Turner is playing well. Sabonis has been playing better than we thought. So I think this team has really come together well. So have they exceeded expectations? Absolutely. Are they going to be a tough out in the playoffs? Sure. But the problem for Indiana, and this really depends on who they match up with, they don't have anyone on the wing who can guard LeBron or guard Giannis or guard, any of the really good forwards. And so it really depends on who they get matched up with. If they end up in the 4 or 5 with the Cavaliers, I think it's pretty much a done deal that they're going to drop quickly. But if they get matched up against, say, the 76ers without Embiid or another team, then maybe there's a chance that Oladipo and the Pacers can make some noise. I think really for them, perhaps more than most teams, the matchup is going to be really crucial.
I think one of the interesting things that they have done, and it seems to me that they've been in preparation for the playoffs in doing this, is they have really geared their offense down to a crawl. We know that defenses tighten up, that pace slows down in the playoffs, and it looks like Indiana's sort of prepping for a Cold War, a very stagnant game that is in the 96-97 possession range. In the month of March, they are the 30th ranked team in pace at 95 possessions a game. And I think what they've done, they're playing very well defensively. They have the 7th best defense in that same span. And so what they're doing is they're putting this situation together where they rely on Victor Oladipo knocking down shots or Miles Turner being able to post up and then just slowing the game down completely, which is a very interesting and contrary style to teams like the 76ers and the Cavaliers. I think that that's probably the way they're going to go about it. Now, I'm not sure how effective it will be, but I certainly think in what I've watched of them lately that they have a game plan in mind, and they're planning to try and execute it against whoever they play in the first round.
That's absolutely true. They know what they want to do, and they want to maximize high percentage looks, which for them, that includes a lot of mid-range shots, but open mid-range shots. And they want to make sure that, they're not making mistakes on defense. And I think this team plays sound in such a way that they have a really high floor. And if you look at their schedule, who they played, who they beat, they don't lose to bad teams. They lose to good teams. Sure, they don't necessarily have the same firepower as a lot of these teams, but they don't lose to bad teams. When they play the teams in the Tankathon, they beat them. And you can't say that about all the teams around them in the playoffs. And so I think that Indiana is really solid, which helps them finish with a high record compared to where other teams of a similar talent level would. But ultimately, I think it really limits their ceiling as well. So I think Indiana should receive all the accolades, and they definitely are in good shape with a good cap situation heading into the summer where they could add a really high-priced free agent on the wing. But do I think the Pacers are going to, out-execute their way to a first-round upset? I'm just going to be honest, no, I don't see that. Unless they play Philly without Embiid, which if you play any team without their superstar, that changes the equation.
Yeah, they have been impressive, and I just feel like probably they need to add another piece this summer. And of course, you got to talk about this, even if just for a second. The piece that seems to fit best for the Indiana Pacers is, of course, Paul George. Like you said, they don't have that wing defender. They don't have that guy who can match up with LeBron, with Ben Simmons, with Giannis, with these bigger forwards. And Paul George is that guy. He's proven himself to be one of the best wing defenders in the league. Do you think there's any chance that we could see a reunited Paul George and the Pacers?
I get the feeling that Paul George kind of cares about perception more than maybe some others do. And because of that, I think he's not going to like the look of going back. That being said, there's no indication that he has a bad relationship with Kevin Pritchard. And so he doesn't seem to have any relationship with Nate McMillan because he hasn't been there. I think it's very possible that he could consider it. Now, do I think it's likely? No. I think that you have to look at Philadelphia and Los Angeles as better options if he does leave the Thunder, which he's expressed that he's really happy there. But I think that it is on the table more than it would be for most players in this kind of scenario. Like Jimmy Butler, he's never going back to Chicago. I mean, that's guaranteed. That was a bad relationship. Kyrie Irving, he's not going back to Cleveland. That was a bad relationship. But could I see, Paul George considering Indiana? I think he should. And if he wants to win, I think he's seen how much of a bloodbath it is out west. And in the East, especially if LeBron's on the move, there could be an opportunity for him to join a really solid Pacers team and kind of lift them right back to where they were, a team that maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling, but is right there in the top couple of seeds every year.
Boy, wouldn't that be just one of the most interesting stories this summer. Now, you mentioned the next team that we're talking about moving on up the list as another potential Paul George destination. And right now, at a half game in front of the Pacers, sitting at a 4 seed beyond all reason, I think, when we consider them at the beginning of the season, is the Philadelphia 76ers. The process seems to have paid off, much to the chagrin of many people around the league. But the Sixers have played really well. They've won 10 games in a row. They even took a big injury to Joel Embiid and sort of mitigated it with their play over the past couple of games without him. I really think that this is one of the most interesting rosters and one of the teams that I like to talk about the most, because they've exceeded expectation. They've played tremendously well, and yet when I watch them, I can't help but think they're going to struggle when it comes playoff time.
I think with any young team, we have this penchant to get really excited about them and to dream about what they could accomplish, and we get a little ahead of ourselves. I think Philadelphia absolutely deserves to be where they are, in big part because Embiid has been healthy, Simmons has been healthy, and they have been excellent together, really better than I think anyone could have predicted this early. But they are still a very young team. Now, they do have some veteran pieces like J.J. Redick, Marco Bellinelli, but I just don't see this team as really having the experience and the chops to make a ton of noise in the playoffs. That being said, they absolutely could win a first-round series, depending on who they get matched up with. And right now, 538, which doesn't know that they lost Embiid, still projects them to finish a game ahead of Cleveland. And that's really important because then they get to play Washington or Milwaukee or Miami rather than Indiana or Cleveland. And so I think that if they can slide up to that 3 seed, which they were before, and they have absolutely the opportunity to do, I think it's going to be really beneficial for a team trying to figure out how to play playoff basketball. And if they're going to have a chance to win that first series as a way of kind of gaining that experience, they want to be up in the 3 seed. And if you look at their schedule, they get to play Brooklyn, Detroit, Dallas, Atlanta. So really, you just got to look at that game at home against Cleveland as being crucial. Can they sustain the success, keep winning without Embiid? I think it's going to be interesting to see, because all season they've been terrible without Embiid. But they've gotten better as the season goes on. Simmons has gotten better as the season's gone on. And if they can win a couple of games here and get that 3 seed, I think that's going to be really impactful for their ability to win their first series.
They do have their schedule is cake. I mean, that's all there is to it. And a lot of people have been saying that for a couple of weeks now, that the Sixers had a very easy schedule down the stretch. I mean, if you look at their last 3 wins, they're on a 10-game win streak. But in this 10-game win streak, they've played New York twice. They've played Brooklyn. They've played Charlotte twice. They beat Memphis and Orlando. I mean, this is not a murderer's row. They have played well, and you can't take that away from them. But it certainly has been beneficial to them to put these tanking teams towards the end of the schedule. And when you look back on it, you don't really see Memphis as an easy win. We didn't think that early in the season. Maybe you sort of think the same way about the Knicks. But when it comes right down to it, and you play the schedule as it is laid out, this has been a pretty easy stretch for the Sixers. Now, one of my major concerns about this team is their perceived inability to create offense outside of Embiid. He has become the focal point. He is a tremendous player, and he has a lot of gravity, something that you and I have discussed with players before about how much gravity they have. And Embiid has a tremendous amount of gravity. He sort of demands a double team, at least 2.5 sets of eyes on him at all times. And that shapes the way teams defend the Sixers. Now, when it comes to playoff basketball, I'm not sure how teams are going to change how they defend Embiid and thereby change how their team defensive scheme is against the Sixers. But as it stands right now, that formula looks like something that's not going to be tremendously successful to me as they get later in the playoffs. Now, they'll probably be able to handle the Wizards or the Heat or the Pacers or whoever they play in the first round. But against the Cavaliers, the Celtics, and the Raptors, teams that have a little bit more of a understanding of these playoff defensive schemes, I think it's going to be pretty tough for them.
I think you're absolutely right that they need to figure that out, and that there's going to be some question marks about how this works. And it'll be interesting to see, because honestly, there's not a lot of pressure on Philadelphia to do well this year because it's their first year. If you look at kind of the history of this team, of the 76ers, I kind of looked at the ELO ratings on 538, and they kind of track the strength of a team. Right now, this is the best Philly team since the Iverson 76ers back in the 2001-2002 season. So they have already exceeded expectations. And really, there's something to suggest that they are better even than their record. Cleaning the Glass has a record, has a tool rather, which shows you their expected wins. And they're 3 wins below where they would be expected based on their other metrics. And really their differential is 5th best in the entire league for the season, which is just crazy to think because this team's got a couple of players who are in their 1st and 2nd year respectively. And so I think that everything's suggesting that Philly's actually better than they've performed this year, which is crazy to think because they've performed so much better than we thought already. So are they going to go deep in the playoffs? That's a great question to ask, and they absolutely have the talent to do so. But I think their youth, their inexperience, and as you said, their system suggests that maybe they're a year or 2 away from really making a deep run, which is totally fine because all we wanted to see this year was a healthy Embiid and a healthy Simmons, and we've gotten that, and it has been a lot of fun to watch.
Absolutely. And there's one more thing about Philadelphia before we move on. They do have the possession of that Lakers pick, which according to Tankathon right now is sitting about the 10th best pick. This is a valuable draft in that it may not have as much talent up top as last year's draft. And it might. It turns out that it might have as much talent up top, but it certainly seems like a draft that's about 10 or 11 players deep. And that finds Philadelphia in possession of a tremendously valuable pick to add a player like Mikal Bridges of Villanova, to add a Miles Bridges from Michigan State. They need a couple of things, and they can go a couple of different routes when they add that player. But having that 10th pick in this draft, boy, that's going to be a big addition to this roster next season.
I think that's been the highlight of the 76ers over the last few years is every year they seem to add another exciting piece, and they absolutely could do that in the playoffs this year in the draft this year. And the other great thing is next year they're effectively adding Markelle Fultz because, with another 6 months to get healthy, to work on that shot, I think there's every reason to expect he'll be 80 to 90% of the player we hoped he would be. And that's going to be a really positive piece to add in next year. And you get to, get excited at the possibilities there. And, you've talked about the 2 Bridges in the draft. I think it's also intriguing to add a guy maybe like Wendell Carter, as a backup center with Rashawn Holmes not playing as well. And then you would have Embiid rotating out with Carter. And that could be exciting as well to keep, consistent rim protection, something they haven't had all season. So I think it'll be really interesting to see kind of how these things come together in the team building aspect with the draft. Then you obviously have free agency where they're going to be trying to attract the best wings on the market. So I think there's plenty to be excited about with Philadelphia. And that starts this postseason, sure, but honestly, I'm looking at next year as a year that this team really can make some waves.
You brought up one interesting point that I just want to touch on briefly. Markelle Fultz added back into the lineup, has played a couple of games now. Do you play him in the playoffs if you're Brett Brown? Do you put him in a situation where he can potentially get in his own head? I mean, obviously, whatever is dealt with this season has been a lot of mental blocks when it comes to his shot, changing his mechanics and all these things. This is a lot of a mental aspect of the game. Do you risk playing him in a playoff situation where he might be one of your 5 best players regardless, but also you have this situation to look forward going forward with him?
I think so much of what has been going on with Markelle Fultz seems to be mental, with all the, shoulder and is it drained and is it whatever is going on and all these different medical terms. There obviously is a mental aspect. And I think that if you tell Markelle Fultz, hey, you're the number 1 pick, we value you, we think you're a great talent, and we're not going to play you in the playoffs, I think that's going to do a blow to him mentally, and you don't know exactly how he's going to respond. So do I think their best rotation includes this current version of Markelle Fultz? No, I don't. I think that TJ McConnell and his defensive toughness and his intensity are going to play great in the playoffs, backing up Ben Simmons. And so I don't think you need Fultz, nor is it going to be best to keep him in there from accomplishing basketball goals on the court for the playoffs. Are they best without him? Maybe. But long-term, they're best with a dialed-in Markelle Fultz who's full of confidence in himself and his jump shot. And to get there, I think that you need to play him this year to build those bonds, to build that, assurance and confidence in himself. And maybe that means you lose a game or 2, sure. But ultimately, I think it's best case for them long-term.
That's an interesting take because I know a lot of people have sort of gone the opposite way and said maybe that he shouldn't play or it might be best for his mental state long term not to play and not to be put in these pressure situations until he's ready for them. But I think he is one of the most interesting players in the playoffs because we don't really know a lot about Markelle Fultz. I mean, we can watch the Washington tape. We can see what he's done this season. But this is a player who has tremendous, tremendous upside. I know that as I did my draft research last year, I became completely enamored in the way he played the game, his length, his ability to get to the cup, the way he shot, which obviously has changed. But this is a player whose upside is sort of undefined, and he could be poised to play some really big minutes, even though he's only played a couple of games, if it turns out that he feels that way, because he certainly has the capacity to be an impact player.
I agree with you. I think he definitely has that in him. And I think it's hard to go, oh, this is what they need to do, that's what they need to do, because none of us are in Fultz's head, and we don't know exactly what's going on there. So it's hard to say for sure, here's where he's at. Ultimately, I think that Brett Brown has shown an ability to really understand his players, and I think that he has reached, all these other guys to help them play to their best of their abilities. Not everyone, though, and I think that you're kind of have to question what's going to happen moving forward, because this team has lost some guys like Noel, Jahlil Okafor has been terrible. You don't want Fultz to go down that path, but I think you also want to make sure that he doesn't lose confidence in himself if you don't play him. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I also think that ultimately he's just going to kind of show them on the court whether he can do it. And if he can, then I think you keep playing in minutes, and maybe that'll help him build his confidence as he sees success on the biggest stage.
All right, let's move on to the third seed, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the defending Eastern Conference champions, a team that is totally different from last year's team and yet somewhat the same. There are a lot of questions surrounding this team. They have the 29th best defensive rating. They're 13-8 since the trades went down to add these pieces. This is a very interesting roster in that we don't really know what we're going to get except for in one instance, and that is with LeBron James. We know we're going to get the pinnacle of NBA play from LeBron James. Now, the question, I guess, is that enough to carry this roster with so many other weak points through the Eastern Conference?
I think that's a great question, and we all want to say, of course, you never bet against LeBron. And he is incredible. He not only is really good offensively when he turns it on, scoring, but also orchestrating the offense, passing his guys open, putting it right in the shooting pocket. He knows his teammates really well and helps elevate them in the playoffs. And so that's how he carries his team each and every year. And so could he do that? Absolutely. You look to that comeback win against the Raptors a couple weeks ago, when he had 17 assists and no turnovers, and was really conducting an orchestra out there that Toronto just didn't know how to stop. Absolutely, that could happen again. The problem is this team has been terrible this year. And you're basically saying the argument is, yeah, they're terrible, and all the metrics say they're terrible, but we think that LeBron will kick it. No, like the Cavaliers, according to Cleaning the Glass, have been the 17th best team in the league. That's below average. That's in the bottom half of the league, and they've been the luckiest. So they have 7 more wins than you would expect them to, which is crazy. And so they've been lucky. They've won close games, and all the numbers suggest that this team is mediocre. Even 538 tries to add in experience and other factors into their playoff predictions. They still have Cleveland as basically even odds to get out of the Eastern Conference with Boston and Philadelphia at less than half the odds of Toronto. So what we're saying is all the numbers suggest this team is mediocre, but LeBron. And sure, I almost agree with that, but at some point, LeBron is going to be a little too old, a little bit too slow. His teams are going to be a little too inconsistent, and they're not going to be able to beat another team in the playoffs. Is this the year? I don't know. But honestly, I think this is the first year where that really is in play, which is almost crazy to think of.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're quite there yet. And we could flash back to this moment in 2 months and laugh at me as they get swept out by the Raptors or whatever happens. I'm just not quite ready to say that any team having watched Toronto quite a few times this season, having watched the Celtics an immense amount of times this season, I'm not ready to say that any of those teams are ready to assume the mantle or to slay the beast that is LeBron. And that's what it is. I mean, you do have to slay the beast. No matter what else happens on a court, when you get locked into a 7-game series with LeBron James, he becomes this monster, unkillable. He's basically the Jason Voorhees of the Eastern Conference. He's never dead until you're sure he's dead, and no one has been able to slay the beast. And I just don't know how, with Kyrie Irving hobbled, with the Celtics losing Gordon Hayward the first game of the season, and he probably won't return, with the Raptors' inability to sort of defend him the other night. There are just so many things that make it very difficult to see a change in the hierarchy of the Eastern Conference, despite whatever happens in these next couple of games. I mean, honestly, if they're the 5th seed, doesn't particularly bother me at all. I still would pencil Cleveland into the NBA Finals in June.
I think that the argument for the Cavaliers finally losing, for LeBron finally not making to the finals, falls apart a little bit when you look at the competition. So Toronto has been incredible. Absolutely better than I think any of us thought. They've redefined their offense. They have this incredible bench. But when you get to the postseason, your bench, is a little bit less involved, and they have not solved the problem of who guards LeBron. That's the biggest question with this team. That's why they've lost him the last 2 postseasons. They got swept by him last year because they don't have a guy that can really match up with him. DeMar Carroll was supposed to be that guy. He couldn't do it. Serge Ibaka, PJ Tucker, they couldn't do it. And now they have a really good, versatile group of bigs, but that doesn't really have a LeBron stopper there. OG Anunoby, he's a rookie. I just don't see him getting the primary assignment. And so then you're looking at Pascal Siakam, who's, I think, a little bit too slow to take LeBron one-on-one. And so you probably have to do a rotation. There's going to be opportunity, times when DeMar DeRozan is on him, when CJ Miles is on him. Those guys can't stop him. So I know there's a lot of time spent on one matchup, but I think that's the key to why Toronto probably is not going to be able to overcome LeBron again unless they can just simply outscore him.
Yeah, and that lineup where you surround LeBron with a lot of shooters is still incredibly effective and very hard to outscore whether they play defense or not. This is going to be a team that's going to be in flux this summer, no matter what happens. I mean, if they win a title, it probably won't be in flux. But with the foreseeable probably getting beaten by the Western Conference champion, be it the Rockets or the Warriors, or maybe even getting bounced out by the Celtics or the Raptors. This is a team that has a lot of turmoil, spawning from what's going to happen to LeBron James and from there on in. But how much do you think that this playoff run is going to impact LeBron's decision? I mean, obviously he hasn't made up his mind, and I think a lot of people closer to the Cavs sort of believe that there's a bigger chance that he comes back than maybe people outside the organization does. But how much do you think hinges on what happens in the next couple of months?
I think that it could have a huge impact because LeBron is making a decision of whether he thinks he can compete for a title here in Cleveland or if he needs to go to a different core and join a different team. And so with all the moves they made at the trade deadline, they've got young players that are going to be on this team for a number of years. Larry Nance and Jordan Clarkson and Rodney Hood. These guys are going to be part of this team, a key part for the years to come. He knows Kevin Love. He knows J.R. Smith. He knows Tristan Thompson. So how do these new pieces fit together when you are in the playoffs? And are these guys that LeBron thinks he can go to war with? Because if he decides that this isn't the group, Cleveland doesn't have any other options. It's this group or bust. And so LeBron decides this isn't the right group. Maybe they do lose or they barely make it through to the finals and get swept by the Warriors or the Rockets. Then I think LeBron goes, all right, I'm going somewhere else. And he starts, getting Philadelphia and Los Angeles and Houston on speed dial.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that you're totally right. That's going to be a big, big deal this summer. But we still have a lot of basketball to be played between now and then, and we're going to have to figure a lot of things out, including whether the Cleveland Cavaliers can get through the Eastern Conference. And they have a pretty tough test ahead of them. They're probably going to have to play both the Raptors and the Celtics, maybe one in the second, one in the third. Maybe it looks like right now they'll have to play Boston in the second and then Toronto in the third, but it might be the other way around. So let's move on and talk about the Boston Celtics. Now they're 53-23. They have tied their win total from last year when they were the worst one seed of all time. And now they look to be a little bit improved, and Brad Stevens is probably one of the best coaches in the league, certainly falls on that list that we talked about Eric Spoelstra being on. With his ability to power this team to 6 straight wins, despite the fact that Kyrie Irving has been sidelined, Marcus Smart has been sidelined, Gordon Hayward, Daniel Tice. This is a team that sort of it looks like a lottery team when you see the depth chart from night to night, and yet Brad Stevens seems to keep the Celtics moving forward in spite of everything.
Brad Stevens, I think, has to be right there in Coach of the Year, and you wanted to give it to Dwayne Casey or Quinn Snyder or any of these other guys, but Brad Stevens, what he's been doing over the last few weeks has been nothing short of wizardry. He's putting all these different pieces, these guys that were only supposed to be in reserve roles. I mean, really, if you look at all the guys that are starting, you look maybe Al Horford being the only one who was supposed to be a starter before the season, but Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Aaron Baines has been playing well. They got Marcus Morris making great contributions. Terry Rozier has been filling in for Kyrie Irving. Even a guy like Gershon Yabusele, who looked like he was dead in the water earlier in the season, has had a couple of moments recently. Semi Ojeleye as well. So you just keep listing players, and it goes on and on to the bottom of the roster because everyone is contributing, not just because they're injured, but because Brad Stevens has them all playing at a high level. And I think it's going to be really crucial to see whether Boston can get that 1 seed. That ensures they're going to have home court advantage, and it seemed impossible a couple of weeks ago when Kyrie Irving went down. But they're right on the cusp. They're only 2 games behind the Raptors, and they get to play them in a couple of nights. And Toronto still has to play Cleveland, still has to play Indiana, still has to play Miami. And so Boston has to like its chances of at least being competitive if they can win in Milwaukee and if they can win in Toronto the next 2 games.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Coach of the Year discussion begins and ends when you see the second seed in the East, whose best players over the past month have been Terry Rozier and Marcus Morris. To me, that's the be-all, end-all of a coach sort of getting his team to overperform. And I think, obviously, people are going to laugh at me and say that I'm a homer, and that's probably fair, but to me, when you fill out that ballot, it's very hard with all the injuries that this team has faced to say that Brad Stevens is not the Coach of the Year.
Yeah, I think you could just keep talking about the work that he's done, and he absolutely deserves to be right there. But I'm sure we'll get to this in a second. Dwayne Casey has a really good case too, because we all thought this team was trending down, and they spiked up. And the contributions he's gotten out of his bench really speak to how good of a coaching job he's done. DeLon Wright has been solid. You look at Jakob Poeltl has been solid. Fred VanVleet is a realistic 6th Man of the Year candidate, and he closes games for this team. And again, we'll get to that in a second, but he has Toronto as an elite team. There really are only 3 elite teams in the league this year, according to their win differential. That's the Rockets, the Warriors, and the Raptors. And so Dwayne Casey absolutely deserves credit for that. And I think that it really makes for an interesting case. And perhaps it's winner take all down the stretch for both the number 1 seed and Coach of the Year.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough matchup, including they played yesterday, or was it Saturday? I guess it was Saturday they played, and then they have to play again on Wednesday. So this is a matchup that might come down to 1 game in the last week of the season. So that's going to be fun to watch. I think the Celtics are one of the most interesting rosters next year. I think maybe their window opens up next year once they have Gordon Hayward back and hopefully Kyrie Irving back from injury. I don't see this team as threatening for the NBA title just because of the injuries that they've had to face. Do you see that as a potential team that can beat Cleveland, can beat Toronto? I mean, I've watched them a lot, and I'm very hopeful that we get that Boston-Toronto Eastern Conference Finals matchup because I think that'll just be 7 fun games of basketball. But I really don't see this team having the ability to knock off some of the best teams in the league just because of the injuries that have hit them all season long.
I think you're right. I think attrition has kind of worn down their upside here, and they've been excellent. They've played a little bit above their heads, by the metrics, they're really about the same quality team as the 76ers, but Philly has lost about 3 or 4 games less than you would have thought. Sorry, won a few games less than you would have thought, and Boston's won a few more games. And so I think Boston's played a little bit above their head. Stevens has been incredible late in games, and they've hit some great shots to win some tight contests, and that's helped them in the standings. Ultimately, I think in the playoffs, they're going to play back towards where they actually are as a team, and so their true talent level just isn't as high without Kyrie Irving and Gordon Hayward. So do I think that this team has a bright future? Absolutely. I think everybody who looks at this team does. But I think that without those pieces this year, they probably aren't going to be able to really make waves to either win the East or win the finals. That being said, I don't think anyone expects them to either. Everyone's going, all right, this was a lost season from the second Gordon Hayward went down. And for them to be in this position in spite of that is incredible. But I don't think whether you're talking fans or management or anything like that are going to be down on this team for not winning the East when they're without their 2 best players.
Yeah, and that just sort of leads into this segue of we're talking about Cleveland and how they're sort of the cream of the crop no matter how they finish. And Boston maybe had a chance with a healthy Gordon Hayward and Kyrie Irving, but I think probably you're totally right that they're looking into the future. They're probably going to be able to add another piece with that Sacramento pick that'll come in next year. They've got a couple of first-rounders from Memphis, from the LA Clippers down the line. So this is a roster still very much in flux, but I think the building blocks of a really tremendous team for the next 5 or 6 years are already in place in Boston. Now let's talk about the number 1 seed, the Toronto Raptors, a team, like you said, that has exceeded every expectation. And I have gone on at length, and I could continue to go on at length about how Dwayne Casey has sort of changed his approach to the game for the better and modernized this team. But the truth is, in the numbers, this is a team with a 7.7 net rating, good for 3rd in the league, just behind the Golden State Warriors and the Houston Rockets. They seem to be an elite team. What can stand in their way besides, obviously we're going to say LeBron James, but what else could stand in the way in this team in their first trip to the NBA Finals?
I think Dwayne Casey's got to figure out his new rotation because it's just not feasible to play 10 and 11 guys every single night in the playoffs. You don't need to, and you're limiting your upside against opponents who are playing their starters all the time. And so Casey's going to have to figure out which of these players are going to have a more limited role or not see the rotation at all. And so is DeLon Wright a guy that he keeps playing? Okay, then Norman Powell, is he going to be out? So then CJ Miles, you need him to space the floor, but you just keep running into issues. And you're not going to play Jakob Poeltl? Well, he's been playing better than Valanciunas has. So then do you just not play Valanciunas? Well, you're paying him for something. It just keeps going around in circles. And so I think that the bench has been incredible, and this expanded rotation has really worked for him. And Casey's gone on record as saying that he wants to play 10 and 11 guys in the playoffs. But I think he's going to have to pare that down. And when he does pare it down, he's going to have to make some tough decisions. And so that could kind of mess with the chemistry this team has. That's a possibility, obviously playing LeBron or one of these great wings. But there's not a lot of reasons to doubt this team other than their history because they have been excellent this year. When you're looking at metrically, you're watching the eye test, they've got a lot of versatile players in the backcourt and the front court. And I feel really strong that this team is for real. That doesn't mean they will win the East. Again, I don't think they match up great against Cleveland, but they absolutely could.
The history is obviously the thing that sort of we all think of when we think of this team, and namely DeRozan and Lowry's poor playoff performances over the past couple of seasons. There's no way to project this kind of thing. There's no way to know. You can't know that a dip like that's coming except for by history, which is, a pretty poor indicator of future results. But do you see something that encourages you that won't happen to this roster again? Or, is it just something that we're going to have to wait to find out?
I think if you look at past years, the weakness has been the backcourt in that if you get length on DeRozan and Lowry, that you can slow them down to the point where they're inefficient and then there's no one else on the team to step up. That's what's killed them the last 4 years, where they've lost the first game of every single playoff series they've been in. They were upset by Brooklyn 4 years ago. Then they were upset by the Wizards. They dropped their first games to Indiana and to Miami 2 years ago, winning those series in 7 before ultimately losing in 6 to the Cavs. Then last year, of course, they had that hard-fought series with the Bucks, 1 in 6, and then were swept by the Cavs when Lowry got hurt. So you see that they're underperforming every single time, and losing that first game gets them off on the wrong foot because teams just throw length at their backcourt. Why do I think that's different? A couple of reasons. One, Fred VanVleet has been underrated still in how good he's been. He has been a really great piece for them. I think he absolutely deserves that number 2 spot for 6th man of the year behind sweet Lou Williams. And they have pieces down the line. So, okay, if they really throw their length and are just focused on stopping the backcourt, well, then you got CJ Miles bombing from outside, and he's launching like 10 threes a game. Okay, well, now we're going to slide to him, and inside, Jonas Valanciunas is bruising. You've got Jakob Poeltl, Siakam, crashing the boards. Serge Ibaka's still here, even though we aren't talking about him. I think that there are enough other options that if a team is really going all out to neutralize 1 or 2 guys, that the Raptors can slide it around. And the reason that's going to work is because they've been doing that all year. They've been sharing the ball. They've been including everyone. No one player is dominating the ball, even as DeRozan is having another great season. And so I think that this team has prepared all year for the playoffs when a team tries to take the ball out of Lowry or DeRozan's hands, and they're ready to move the ball around, to get the open shot, and to kind of keep their offense flowing. So I think that when I look at this team and I watch them play, I see a different team, and I see a better one. Again, doesn't mean they're going to win, but I think I'm much more confident in that than any other year under the current regime.
All right, Josh. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, man. You've really enlightened us yet again with the Eastern Conference. Now, I plan on having you back on in the next couple of weeks when we get to the matchups. It's very hard to sort of talk about teams in a vacuum. It's much easier to talk about teams when they are matched up head-to-head. So hopefully you'll be able to come back and help us break down the actual matchups of the playoffs.
Yeah, Alex, I'm excited for that. I think there's a lot of really smart coaches that are going to be in the playoffs this year. Not that there aren't every year, but I'm really excited to kind of drill down into the chess match. How is Quinn Snyder and a Mike D'Antoni matchup? Or how would, Brad Stevens and Eric Spoelstra match up? I'm really excited to kind of see these games of wits and strategies and schemes. So definitely would love to come back on and talk through that with you.
Oh, yeah, we're definitely going to have you back in the next couple of weeks. Appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you want to get a plug in for? I know you got to head off, but is there anything you really got to tell us about before you go?
Yeah, so I'm actually this week, I've been really kind of digging into last year's draft class, trying to look at, okay, where are the guys who are performing better and worse than we expected? We talked about Markelle Fultz, Jason Tatum, we just touched on with Boston and a lot of other players. So I'm going to be dropping some content on HoopsHabit, on 94 Free Report, and on the Lottery Mafia, all 3 of the sites I write for this week. So keep an eye on for that as I dabble in the draft waters.
Can't wait, man. I'm always down to read draft stuff, so I'll be checking that out. Josh, thanks for coming on the show, man, and appreciate all that you do for us. And every time you come on, I feel like I learn about 10 new things. So, that's for me. I don't care about what everybody else is learning, but for me, that's enough reason to have these hour-long discussions with you.
All right. Well, no pressure for next time, huh, Alex?
Exactly. So you know what you have to live up to now. All right, man. We'll talk to you later, okay?
All right. Thanks for having me.